The Göktürk Chronicles, Episode 3, To Be a Turk. Written by Emre Yavuz. 8 years have passed since young Bumin Ashina first learned the truth about his heritage. The silver wolf pendant still rests against his chest, but the boy who once clutched it in confusion has grown into a young man of 17 summers. His shoulders have broadened, his voice has deepened, and his understanding of the world has been tempered by years of watching his father navigate the treacherous currents of Rouran politics. The tribute collections still come with each turning season, but Bumin no longer sees them through the eyes of a confused child. He watches instead with the calculating gaze of a future leader, learning how power truly works, how survival sometimes demands choices that would make the ancestors weep, and how the simple question of identity, what makes a Turk, can become the most complicated riddle of all. This spring of 523 AD will test everything Tuwu has taught his son about the art of political survival. News is spreading across the steppes like wildfire. The Tölös Federation has risen in revolt against their Rouran masters. For the first time in generations, Turk warriors are riding to war under their own banners, fighting for their own freedom. But they are not fighting alone, and that Bumin is about to discover changes everything. The messenger arrived at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat and foam despite the morning chill. Bumin heard the hoofbeats from inside his father's yurt, where he had been helping Tuwu prepare the spring census. Another tedious requirement of their vassalage, counting every horse, every warrior, every resource that might be called upon by their Rouran overlords. Khan Tuwu, the rider called, using the title that was simultaneously true and false. True because the Ashina still acknowledged their chief as Khan among themselves. False because the Rouran recognized him only as a tribal administrator serving at their pleasure. Bumin followed his father outside, noting how Tuwu's face immediately assumed the careful neutrality that had become second nature over the years. In the early morning light, the messenger looked like he had ridden hard through the night, his eyes red with exhaustion, his clothes dusty with the grit of forced travel. "Speak," Tuwu said simply, but Bumin could hear the tension beneath his father's calm tone. "The Tölös have risen," the messenger said, and despite his exhaustion, excitement crept into his voice. "Börü Khan has declared independence from the Rouran. They've destroyed the tribute collector's escort and sent word to all Turk clans. It's time to reclaim our freedom." Bumin felt his heart leap at the words. After years of submission and careful words and bowing to foreign masters, finally, someone had acted. Finally, one of the great Turk federations had remembered they were wolves, not dogs. But his father's expression didn't change. If anything, Tuwu looked older suddenly, as if the news had added years to his face. "How many clans have joined them?" Tuwu asked. 7 so far, with more sending delegations. The Bugu are wavering. They seek your counsel, Khan Tuwu. Your voice carries weight among the old Confederation families. Bumin glanced at his father, expecting to see the fire of rebellion kindling in his eyes. Instead, he saw calculation, the complex mental arithmetic of a man who had learned to count costs before dreams. "Give your horse to our herders for care," Tuwu said to the messenger. "Rest and eat. We will speak more when you've recovered from your journey." As the messenger was led away, Bumin could no longer contain himself. "Father, this is what we've been waiting for. The Tölös are strong if we join them now, while the revolt is fresh." "Come," Tuwu interrupted, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. We have much to discuss. Inside the yurt, Tuwu poured fermented mare's milk into 2 carved cups, the ritual gestures buying him time to think. Bumin had seen this pattern before. His father's way of processing information, weighing options, considering angles that weren't immediately obvious. "Tell me what you think of this news," Tuwu said finally, settling across the fire from his son. "I think the Tölös are brave," Bumin said immediately. "I think they're doing what we should have done years ago. The Rouran are strong, but they're not invincible. If enough clans unite..." "And what do you think the Rouran response will be?" Bumin paused, recognizing the tone his father used when he was being taught rather than simply questioned. "They'll send armies. Try to crush the revolt before it spreads." "Yes. And where will those armies come from?" The question seemed obvious at first, then suddenly wasn't. Bumin frowned, working through the implications. From their garrisons, from their tribal levies. Understanding hit him like a physical blow. From their vassal clans, from us. Tuwu nodded slowly. "The Rouran are clever rulers, my son. They learned long ago that the most efficient way to control Türk peoples is to make Türk peoples control each other. When the Tölös revolt, they won't face only Rouran soldiers. They'll face Türk warriors riding under Rouran banners, led by Türk chiefs who have calculated that loyalty to the empire serves their people better than rebellion." Bumin felt the familiar pendant heavy against his chest, its weight suddenly seeming less like a promise and more like an accusation. "So we'll be ordered to fight them, to fight other Turks?" "Almost certainly." The simple acknowledgement hung between them. Outside, Bumin could hear the sounds of camp life continuing. Children playing, women preparing the morning meal, herders calling to their animals. Normal sounds of a normal day, while the world shifted beneath their feet. "What will we do?" Bumin asked quietly. Instead of answering, Tuwu reached into a leather chest and withdrew a collection of wooden tablets, each covered with carefully carved symbols. Bumin recognized them. Message sticks that had arrived over the years from other clans. Coded communications that allowed careful coordination despite Rouran surveillance. 3 months ago, Tuwu said, selecting one of the tablets. "This came from the Bugu. They wanted to know our position if the Tölös moved openly against their overlords." He chose another tablet. 6 weeks ago, this arrived from the Tölös themselves. Börü Khan was testing support, seeing who might join an alliance. A third tablet. 2 weeks ago, from the Rouran district commander. Rumors of unrest among the Eastern Federations. Increased vigilance required from all loyal vassals. Bumin stared at the collection of messages, beginning to understand the complex web of communication and calculation that existed beneath the surface of apparent submission. "You knew this was coming." "I suspected. The signs have been building for months. Bad harvests in Rouran territory, pressure on their western borders, internal succession disputes. When empires show weakness, subject peoples begin to test their chains. Then why didn't we prepare to join the revolt?" Tuwu's voice carried no judgment, only the patience of a teacher working through a difficult lesson. "Tell me, what happens if the revolt succeeds?" Bumin felt like he was walking through a maze where every path led to another question. "The Türk clans regain their independence. We restore the old confederation." "And if it fails?" asked Tuwu further. "The Rouran crush the rebels, execute the leaders, Scatter the tribes. Yes. And what does the Rouran Empire remember about clans that stayed loyal during the rebellion? The pieces began fitting together with horrible clarity. They remember who can be trusted, Bumin said slowly, almost whispering. Who deserves rewards? Who gets better treatment in the future? And what do they remember about clans that joined the rebellion, even if those clans claimed they were forced to participate? Bumin closed his eyes, finally seeing the full scope of the trap. They remember them as traitors. Even if we said we had no choice, even if we joined at the last moment to avoid suspicion. Now you begin to understand the mathematics of survival under imperial rule, Tuwu said. The Rouran have designed a system where rebellion and loyalty are both dangerous, but where the timing of your choice determines whether your people live or die. The fire crackled between them, its light casting shifting shadows on the yurt walls. Bumin thought of the stories his mother had told him, of Ashina the Wolfborn building confederations and challenging empires. Those heroes seemed to belong to a simpler world, where right and wrong were clearly divided, and courage was enough to change history. So we do nothing? He asked. We just watch while other Turks fight for their freedom? We do what we must to ensure our people survive to see another day, Tuwu replied. And we remember that survival is not the same as surrender, just as loyalty is not the same as love. The summons came 3 days later, as Tuwu had predicted. A Rouran official arrived with an escort of 20 cavalry and orders written on silk. All tribal levies within the district were to report for military service within 1 week. The rebellion in the east required immediate suppression. Bumin stood beside his father as they received the orders, watching Tuwu's face remain perfectly composed as he acknowledged the commands that would send Ashina warriors to fight their own people. The Rouran official, a different man from the tribute collectors, this one younger and harder, with the bearing of someone who had earned his position through military service rather than administrative efficiency, seemed to take their compliance for granted. Your warriors have a reputation for competence, the official said as he prepared to leave. See that they maintain it. The Khan of Khans values reliability in his vassals. The Ashina have always served faithfully, Tuwu replied, the words carrying layers of meaning that the Rouran couldn't possibly understand. After the official departed, Bumin followed his father to the horse lines, where Göktürk was inspecting the animals that would carry their warriors to war. His uncle's face was grim, the expression of a soldier who understood that some victories felt like defeats. How many? Göktürk asked without preamble. 40 mounted warriors, Tuwu replied. Standard levy for a clan our size. And our orders? Support the main column, follow the lead of senior commanders, demonstrate loyalty through effective service. Göktürk spat in the dust. Turks killing Turks. The ancestors must be weeping. The ancestors, Tuwu said quietly, lived in a different world. We must survive in this one. That evening, as the chosen warriors prepared their gear and said goodbye to their families, Bumin found himself walking the edges of camp, trying to process the collision between his childhood dreams of heroic resistance and the brutal realities of political survival. He paused at the yurt of Borak, the boy whose older brother had been taken for military service 8 years ago. Borak was now 15 himself, old enough to be included in the levy. Through the felt walls, Bumin could hear the quiet sounds of a family trying not to weep as they prepared to send another son to war. "It's not right," a voice said behind him. Bumin turned to see Istemi approaching. His younger brother, now 13, tall for his age and carrying himself with the confidence that came from being the chief's second son. "What's not right?" Bumin asked, though he knew the answer. "Making us fight other Turks, making us choose between our own people and our survival." Istemi's voice carried an edge of anger that reminded Bumin of his own feelings 8 years ago, when simple answers had seemed possible. "What would you do differently?" Bumin asked. "I'd refuse. I'd tell them to fight their own wars. And when they came with 10 times our numbers to punish that refusal." Istemi was quiet for a moment, working through implications he hadn't fully considered. "We'd die," Bumin said gently. "All of us. Men, women, children. The Ashina would become a memory, like so many other clans that chose courage over calculation." "So we're cowards?" The question hit harder than Istemi probably intended. Bumin found himself thinking of his father's careful neutrality, of the complex web of messages and alliances that existed beneath apparent submission, of the 40 warriors preparing to ride against their own people. "I don't know," he said finally. "I used to think I knew the difference between courage and cowardice. Now I'm not sure there is one, not in situations like this." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of preparation and farewell that filled the camp. Finally, Istemi spoke again. "When will we know? When will we know if we're still Turks, or if we've become something else?" It was the question that had been haunting Bumin since the messenger's arrival. The question hidden in his father's lessons about survival and calculation. When did necessary collaboration become willing betrayal? When did strategic patience become permanent submission? When did a wolf pretending to be a dog forget it had ever been a wolf? "I don't know that either," Bumin admitted. "Maybe that's what we have to figure out." The war party departed at dawn, 40 Ashina warriors riding east under banners that bore both their own wolf symbols and the marks of Rouran authority. Bumin was among them. His father had decreed that at 17, he was old enough to see how such campaigns were conducted, old enough to learn lessons that couldn't be taught in the safety of their own territory. The ride itself took 5 days, joining similar contingents from other vassal clans as they converged on the Rouran assembly point. Bumin found himself studying the faces of warriors from other tribes, wondering what they thought of their orders, whether any of them felt the same complex mixture of shame and necessity that seemed to characterize his own feelings. Some seemed genuinely loyal to the Rouran cause, chiefs whose clans had prospered under imperial rule, warriors who had earned honor and advancement through service to the empire. Others appeared resigned, going through the motions of duty without enthusiasm or hatred. A few carried themselves with barely concealed anger, men who had learned to hide their true feelings but couldn't eliminate them entirely. On the 3rd night of travel, as they camped near a river that marked the traditional boundary between Ashina and Tölös territory, Bumin found himself in conversation with a warrior from the Bugu clan, a man perhaps 30 years old, scarred from previous campaigns, who carried himself with the easy competence of someone who had seen enough war to understand its costs. "First time fighting Turks?" the Bugu warrior asked, apparently reading something in Bumin's expression. "Is it that obvious?" The man smiled grimly. You have the look of someone still trying to reconcile what they're doing with what they believe. It passes, eventually. Does it? The uncertainty. The uncertainty, yes. What replaces it? The warrior shrugged. That depends on who you are when the fighting stops. They reached the main Rouran force the next day, and Bumin got his first look at the true scale of imperial military organization. The assembled army numbered perhaps 8,000 warriors, roughly half Rouran regulars and half tribal levies like themselves. It was more soldiers than Bumin had ever seen in one place, a demonstration of the resources the Empire could deploy when challenged. But it was not until the second day at the assembly point that Bumin truly understood how seriously the Rouran were taking this rebellion. Word spread through the camp like wildfire. The Kagan himself had arrived. Anagui Khan rode into camp at midday with an escort of his personal guard, and Bumin found himself pressed forward with hundreds of other warriors to catch a glimpse of the man who ruled the greatest empire on the steppes. From his position in the crowd, perhaps 50 paces distant, Bumin could see why the Rouran followed this man with such devotion. He was perhaps 30 years old, in the prime of his strength and confidence. Tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had been born to command armies. His horse was magnificent, a black stallion that seemed to dance rather than walk. And his equipment was the finest Bumin had ever seen. Scale armor that caught the sunlight like water, a sword whose pommel gleamed with precious stones, the wolf-tail banners of supreme authority flowing behind him. But it was Anagui's presence that truly impressed. Even at a distance, even surrounded by his elite guard, there was something about him that commanded attention. He carried himself like a man who had never doubted his right to rule, who had tested that right in battle and found it unbreakable. When he looked out over the assembled army, Bumin felt as though those eyes could see everything. Every doubt, every hidden loyalty, every question about the righteousness of their cause. "That," said the Bugu warrior beside him, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and fear, "is what a real Khan looks like." Anagui dismounted and strode to a raised platform that had been hastily constructed for the occasion. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the gathered thousands, trained by years of addressing armies and councils. "Warriors of the Empire," he began. And even in those simple words, Bumin could hear the authority that had united a fractured people and forged them into the dominant power of the steppes. "You have been called here to defend not just our borders, but our very identity as a civilized people. The Eastern rebels have forgotten the lessons of history. They believe that strength lies in independence, that freedom means the right to ignore the greater good." Anagui paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. "They are wrong. Strength lies in unity. Freedom lies in accepting one's place in a greater order. The Tölös have chosen chaos over order, rebellion over loyalty. They have made themselves enemies, not just of the Empire, but of civilization itself." Bumin found himself studying the Kagan's face, trying to read the man behind the words. Was this genuine conviction or masterful performance? Did Anagui truly believe in the righteousness of his cause? Or was he simply skilled at making others believe? "Some of you," Anagui continued, "share blood with these rebels. Some may even sympathize with their claimed grievances. Let me be clear. Kinship means nothing without loyalty. Sympathy without action is meaningless. You are here not as Turks or Bugu or Ashina, but as servants of the empire that has given you peace, prosperity, and purpose. The words hit Bumin like physical blows. Here was the central question of his existence, stated with brutal clarity by the man who had shaped the modern world. Loyalty to empire versus loyalty to people. Order versus freedom. Survival versus identity. When this campaign is finished, Anagui declared, when the rebels have been brought to heel and order restored, the empire will remember who stood firm and who wavered. Those who serve faithfully will be rewarded. Those who fail in their duty will discover that imperial mercy has limits. The threat was unmistakable, but it was delivered with such calm confidence that it seemed less like intimidation than simple statement of natural law. This was how the world worked. This was how Anagui had built his empire. Not through fear alone, but through the systematic creation of circumstances where loyalty became the only rational choice. As the Kagan concluded his address and withdrew to his command yurt, Bumin found himself shaken in ways he hadn't expected. He had come here prepared to hate the enemy, to see the Rouran as foreign oppressors imposing their will through crude force. Instead, he had encountered something far more dangerous. A leader who might actually be right, whose vision of order and unity might genuinely serve the greater good, even if it required the destruction of everything Bumin had been taught to value. Impressive, isn't he? Tuwu said quietly, appearing at Bumin's shoulder. Now you understand why simple rebellion is not enough. It takes more than courage to challenge a man like that. It takes wisdom, patience, and perfect timing. Bumin nodded silently, still processing what he had witnessed. Anagui Khan was not the crude tyrant of his imagination, but something far more complex and threatening. A visionary who had succeeded in building exactly the kind of unified empire that Ashina the Wolfborn had dreamed of centuries ago. The only difference was that it served Rouran interests rather than Türk ones. That night, as Bumin lay in his bedroll staring up at the stars, he found himself wondering if Anagui might actually be what the steppes needed. A strong leader capable of ending the cycle of tribal warfare and bringing lasting peace. The thought disturbed him more than any nightmare could have. The Rouran commander was a general named Kolbai, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency had reached even the Ashina camps, addressed the assembled tribal leaders with the casual authority of someone who had never doubted his right to command. The Eastern Rebellion will be crushed quickly and completely, he announced. Börü Khan and his supporters have forgotten the costs of defying imperial authority. We will remind them, and we will ensure that no other federation makes the same mistake. He outlined the campaign strategy with brutal simplicity. The main force would strike at the heart of Tölös territory, overwhelming their military resistance before it could fully organize. Meanwhile, smaller columns would systematically destroy the economic foundations of rebellion, burning winter camps, scattering herds, eliminating the resources that sustained independent resistance. Some of you, Kolbai continued, his gaze moving across the tribal leaders, may feel conflicted about fighting people who share your ancestry. Let me be clear. There are no Turks in this campaign. There are loyal vassals of the empire, and there are rebels against lawful authority. The rebels have chosen to abandon their identity as civilized peoples. They will be treated accordingly. The message was unmistakable. Questions of ethnic kinship or traditional loyalty were irrelevant. Only political allegiance mattered, and political allegiance was determined by actions, not bloodlines or cultural heritage. That night, as the army prepared for the final march into Tölös territory, Bumin sat with his father and uncle around a small fire, trying to process what he had learned. "Do you think he believes it?" Bumin asked quietly. "The general, I mean. About there being no Turks, only loyal vassals and rebels?" Tuwu considered the question seriously. "I think he believes in the utility of that distinction. Whether he believes in its truth, that's a different matter." "What's the difference?" "The difference," Kutluk said, speaking up for the first time that evening, "is that useful lies can become true if enough people act on them for long enough. Tell a Turk he's not a Turk often enough, and eventually he might believe you." Or, Tuwu added, tell him often enough that his survival depends on acting like something else, and eventually the distinction between acting and being becomes unclear. Bumin fingered the wolf pendant beneath his shirt, thinking about 8 years of careful neutrality, of calculated submission, of choosing survival over principle. How many compromises did it take before compromise became character? How many times could you deny what you were before the denial became truth? "Father," he said finally, "when this campaign is over, when we've helped crush the rebellion, what will we be then?" Tuwu was quiet for a long time, staring into the dying fire. "I don't know, my son. I suppose we'll find out." The battle itself, when it came, was less a battle than an execution. The Tölös had chosen to make their stand in a valley that should have favored their defensive position, but they were outnumbered more than 3-1, and many of their warriors were already exhausted from weeks of skirmishing with Rouran advance forces. What resistance they offered was brave, but ultimately futile. Bumin found himself in the second wave of the assault, watching as the first rank of Rouran cavalry shattered the Tölös line like a hammer striking glass. The fighting was desperate and brief, with individual acts of heroism swallowed up in the mathematics of superior numbers and better organization. What disturbed him most was how familiar the enemy looked. These weren't foreign invaders or alien warriors. They were Turks like himself, riding horses like his, carrying weapons like his, dying for causes that probably weren't very different from his own. When a Tölös warrior fell beneath Ashina's spears, Bumin could see in his face the same mixture of courage and fear that he recognized in his own companions. The decisive moment came when Börü Khan himself was surrounded and brought down. Bumin was close enough to see the Tölös leader in his final moments. A man perhaps 40 years old, bloodied but unbroken, facing death with the dignity befitting someone who had chosen his own fate rather than having it chosen for him. As Börü Khan died, something seemed to go out of the Tölös resistance. Warriors who had been fighting with desperate courage suddenly lost heart, breaking and fleeing rather than continuing a battle they could no longer win. Within an hour, organized resistance had collapsed entirely. The aftermath was worse than the battle itself. Kolbai had ordered that examples be made, and the Rouran regulars set about their work with systematic efficiency. Leaders were executed, families scattered, herds confiscated. The Tölös Federation, which had existed for generations, was formally dissolved and its territory redistributed among loyal neighbors. But it was the fate of the common warriors that haunted Bumin most. Those who had survived the battle were given a choice. They could accept integration into loyal clans as individual families, abandoning their Tölös identity entirely, or they could face the consequences of continued resistance. Most chose integration. Bumin watched as proud warriors who had fought for independence only hours before swore new oaths of loyalty to chiefs they had never served, accepting new clan marks and renouncing their former allegiances. They were told this was mercy, that the empire was generous to those who acknowledged their errors and chose civilized behavior over barbarian rebellion. Standing among the Ashina warriors who had helped make this possible, Bumin felt a kind of sickness that had nothing to do with the blood and death he had witnessed. These surrendering Tölös warriors weren't enemies being defeated. They were futures being eliminated, possibilities being murdered, dreams being buried alive. "Do you understand now?" Tu'u asked quietly as they prepared to march home. "Do you see why rebellion is not always the most courageous choice?" Bumin looked around at the scattered remnants of Tölös resistance, at the families being forcibly relocated, at the warriors who had chosen survival over principle. "I understand that rebellion can fail," he said. "I understand that failure has consequences. And I understand why you chose as you did, why we chose as we did. But," Bumin was quiet for a moment, watching a group of former Tölös warriors receiving their new clan markings, symbolically erasing their former identities. "But I don't know if understanding means agreeing. I don't know if successful survival is the same as successful living." Tu'u followed his gaze to the surrender ceremony taking place nearby. "Perhaps," he said, "that's a question each generation has to answer for itself." The return journey took longer than the march east, partly because of the prisoners and confiscated livestock that slowed the column, partly because the weather had turned bad, with early autumn rains that turned the grasslands muddy and treacherous. But mostly, Bumin thought, it was because no one was eager to reach home and face the questions that would be waiting there. How do you explain to your family that you helped destroy people who might have been their cousins? How do you celebrate a victory that felt like a defeat of everything you claimed to believe? On the last night before they reached Ashina territory, Bumin found himself unable to sleep. He left his bedroll and walked to the edge of camp, where sentries kept watch against the possibility of vengeful survivors or opportunistic raiders. The night was clear for once, the stars visible in patterns that had guided Türk travelers for generations beyond count. Göktürk found him there, as Bumin had somehow known he would. "Difficult campaign," his uncle said, settling beside him on a fallen log. "Yes. Your first time seeing how the Empire maintains order?" "Yes." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of a sleeping army, snoring, restless movement, the occasional challenge and response between sentries. Finally, Göktürk spoke again. "When I was your age, I thought the world was simpler. I thought courage meant never compromising, never bending, never accepting less than what you believed you deserved. What do you think now?" "Now I think courage is more complicated. Sometimes it means standing firm. Sometimes it means knowing when to bend so you don't break. Sometimes it means making choices that feel like betrayal so that future choices remain possible." Bumin touched the pendant at his throat, feeling its familiar weight. "And how do you know which kind of courage a situation requires?" "You don't. Not really. You make your best guess based on incomplete information, and then you live with the consequences. Sometimes you guess right, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you don't find out which it was until years later. What if you're never sure? What if every choice feels like the wrong choice?" Göktürk was quiet for a long time. then maybe the question isn't whether you're making the right choice. Maybe the question is whether you're making choices that keep the possibility of future right choices alive. Is that what we did? I don't know. Ask me in 10 years, or 20. Or ask your children when they're old enough to judge what we've done. They returned to camp as the eastern sky began to lighten with the approach of dawn. Tomorrow, they would be home, with all the complications and contradictions that home represented. They would be welcomed as successful warriors who had served their obligations faithfully. They would also be the men who had helped crush the last major Türk rebellion in living memory. Whether those two identities could coexist, whether the Ashina could remain Türk while serving Rouran interests, whether survival was compatible with honor, those were questions that would have to be answered through actions rather than words, through choices that lay somewhere in the uncertain future. For now, it was enough to have survived another test of imperial loyalty. It was enough to have kept their people intact for another season, another year, another generation. Whether that was enough in any larger sense remained to be seen. As they broke camp and began the final march home, Bumin found himself thinking about the title of the question that had haunted him throughout the campaign. When is a Türk a Türk? He still didn't have an answer, but he was beginning to suspect that asking the question might be more important than answering it. That the struggle to maintain identity in the face of impossible choices might itself be what defined them as a people. The wolf pendant rested warm against his chest as they rode toward home, carrying with it the weight of 20 generations and the hope of generations yet unborn. Whatever else they were or weren't, whatever compromises they had made or would make, they were still here, still asking the hard questions, still carrying the memory of what they had been and the dream of what they might become. And perhaps, for now, that was enough to remain Türk.